Now, if you're going to be working in any type of Microsoft administration services these days, there are some fundamental principles that are very important that you understand. So what I want to do is I want to get into some of the foundations of understanding things like Microsoft domains, understanding some of the networking technologies, RAS and VPNs and virtualization, and also we're going to talk about the cloud services and how all that fits into this. But it's important to kind of start from the beginning so you can understand where things have been, understand where things are going, and you have to consider the fact that the world is transitioning now more into a cloud-oriented environment. But in the past, everything was managed on-prem or on-premise, and we got to talk about this transition and how things were and how things are now and where Microsoft is going. So to start with, we go back in time to the 1950s, 1960s. They had mainframes, these gigantic computers that would take up like entire rooms. They used vacuum tubes. And then as we moved into the 1970s, something miraculous happened. They created what was known as an IC, an integrated circuit, which allowed basically binary math to be processed through little chips. And this is where personal computing became popular. So in the 1980s, personal computers started coming out. I'm going to draw this little symbol here to represent a computer. And I tell you what, I'm going to create another little symbol here to kind of represent a bunch of computers. So in the 1980s, companies started buying PCs and personal computers, and they started showing up in people's offices, and eventually, they were networking them together and all of that. And so this is where things really get started. Now, of course, in those days, one of the problems was we lived in what was called a peer-to-peer network. So what would happen is these computers you could network these computers together with various technologies, but there was no centralization, meaning each computer was equal. There was no computer that controls all the other computers. A network admin would have to, if they wanted to make changes, they'd have to sit down at each and every computer to make those changes or get users to help them, which was always a nightmare. And so that didn't, it worked, but it didn't work very efficiently, all right? Now, as we moved into the 1990s, there was a company that was gaining ground called Novell, and they had a product called NetWare, which was the idea of that was to use a server that would help manage machines and also allow people to share files easier. Whereas in a peer-to-peer network back originally, these machines would have to share files with each other and people would have to know each other's passwords. It just didn't work very well. Well, eventually with the creation of the file server concept, you had a more powerful machine that you could share files on and all that. And eventually Novell even came out with the idea of a server that could manage other machines. Now this is kind of where Microsoft comes in. Microsoft created their product called NT, and they created this concept of a domain controller, which is a special type of server that can manage these other servers. Now, fast forward, they came out with what was known as a domain, but fast forward to the year 2000, Microsoft releases their newest domain technology, and they call it Active Directory. And Active Directory domains were represented by a triangle. All right, and a domain controller was a server essentially that had a database on it, and that database was the Active Directory database. So let's just kind of fix that here. This little cylinder looking thing I'm going to make here is going to represent my Active Directory database. So AD. All right, and this is what we still call to this day. We call it ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And usually if you hear that term, Active Directory Domain Services, it means it's an on-premise domain. Although there is a version of this that can be hosted in the cloud known as Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I'm not getting into that right now. So anyway, you would always want to have more than one domain controller. The reason you want to have more than one domain controller is because the same reason you have more than one of any type of server, really. One reason being to break up the disbursement of load, these machines will authenticate with these domain controllers, and the more machines you got, you don't want all of that just going to one domain controller, right? The other consideration is redundancy. If you only have one and that server goes down, well, you're in trouble, right? So we want to have multiple. The other thing about domain controllers that are interesting is that they replicate. So, for example, I'm going to make a little smiley face guy here, and this little smiley face guy is going to represent my user. So we create a user account on a domain controller. Now, the interesting thing about user accounts, or the interesting thing really about domain controllers, is that they replicate. So everything you do on one will replicate over to the other. So if I create a user account on that first one, well, replication is going to occur between both of them. And so this little arrow thing I'm going to make here is going to represent replication. So domain controllers replicate. That means that this user could log on to any one of these thousands machines, and it's going to authenticate with the domain controller. All right. The authentication protocol that is used is the protocol known as Kerberos. All right. Kerberos is the authentication protocol. What is a protocol? It's like a language, basically. Okay. Now there was an older protocol that it also supported called NTLM. That was for legacy, for older prior to the year 2000 machines. Now that protocol allowed us to have encrypted passwords and all that, and authenticate securely and all that fun stuff. The other thing is Active Directory uses a language known as the Directory Service Language, and that language was called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. Now all that is, again, this is all decades old at this point. At the time when it came out, it was cutting edge, but it is a bit dated nowadays. But it still works, and it's still pretty secure, though there are some considerations on security that I'm not going to explain right now. Now, the other thing that's important about Active Directory is that all machines have to have a name. And the name must be, of course, associated with an IP address and all of that. And so there is a service that we use it on the internet all the time, called DNS, Domain Name Service. Our domain must have a name. Usually when you name your domain, you would name it after your company, and a lot of people even name their domains based on their web presence. So for example, my domain might be called examlabpractice.com. That's my company, my web presence. And I'm going to need to have a server in my domain that can associate the names and IP addresses together. So that server is called a DNS server. DNS, Domain Name System Server. And that server will also have to have a little database on it, and that database will be our DNS database. Okay. So we'll just draw another little cylinder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this, border it with red, and then I'm going to color code the database red, which means that this database, the DNS database, is associated with that name. Now what happens is our machines, clients, domain controllers, we also might even have, let's draw a file server over here. Pretty common that we have file servers in our environment. Okay. All of these machines would register with our DNS. All right. And this allows for the centralization of name resolution, meaning they register their IP addresses into this database, and then now anytime a machine needs to find another machine, it can query DNS. So for example, these machines all have to authenticate by your domain controllers. They can query DNS and say, hey, DNS, do you know what the address is of one of my domain controllers so I can authenticate? And DNS can reply back and say, yeah, here is the information. At that point, the client can go and authenticate. So it works very efficiently. Now, all of this together, this idea of domain controllers, this triangle you see here, this provides centralization. So we moved away from peer-to-peer networking back in the day where every machine was kind of its own boss and there was no centralized way of managing things, to now we are working in a centralized environment. These domain controllers help us centralize. This DNS service helps us centralize. So we now have some central control over things. One of the great things about our domain controllers too is we have these wonderful things called GPOs, group policy objects. A group policy object is this object that you can create that has all these settings, parameters, any type of attribute you want to configure or change on machines, you can do it through a GPO. So for example, if your boss walks up to you and says, hey, I want you to force the firewalls to be turned on all these machines. I want to make sure that the antivirus is always up to date. I want you to disable some of the wallpaper feature. I don't want people putting crazy wallpapers on their machine. So I mean, the sky's the limit. There are literally thousands of things you can do inside of a GPO. But what happens is that GPO can instruct these machines to turn things on and turn things off. GPOs also replicate. So when you create a GPO on a domain controller, it replicates over to the other domain controller. So it doesn't matter which machines authenticate with which domain controller. All right. So these GPOs can be deployed out to these machines, and this is how you turn things on, turn things off. You could even deploy software with that if you wanted to. So it was very, very powerful, a very, very powerful system for managing everything. All right. Of course, let's throw the internet into the mix here. Let's say that this little cloud is going to represent the internet, and let's talk about a little bit about how that sort of fits into the picture. Let me just clean it up here with the mighty stroke of my paintbrush. I will clean up the internet. All right. All right, so then we have the internet, right? So maybe we've got an internet connection that's coming in here, all right? And of course, you don't want to just leave your internal network exposed, so your company would generally have a firewall, right? And we'll just put that firewall right here. And so now we have a secure way for traffic to flow out to the internet, and the only things that can come in would be things that we send out, and we could allow things through that firewall if we want to. Now, this is a traditional domain. This is the way we've done things for 20 years, all right? And in this next little section, I want to talk about expansion on all of this and where things have gone with things like RAS and all that, and VPN and virtualization. So that'll wrap this little section up, and we'll move on to the next. I now want to talk about some concepts that are also sort of the foundation of how we've done things over the years. It's important to understand how we've done things over the years so we can understand how things are now. So looking back, we have an Active Directory domain, ADDS as it's called, Active Directory Domain Services, which uses the LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol, which uses Kerberos for authentication, or for the legacy back in the 90s devices that used NTLM, New Technology LAN Manager, which isn't all very new these days, but even Kerberos is pretty old considering we've been using it for decades, and I think actually the protocol even came out back in the 1980s. So we got some data technologies, but the technologies have been updated, a lot of them over the years, to be secure, so you can still feel comfortable using those. But let's talk about some different scenarios now. The first thing I want to look at is the scenario of what happens when we have a user who is not at the office. So this person is working from home. Working from home is a lot more popular nowadays than it has been in the past, so it's very common. And this person needs the ability perhaps to be able to connect in and access services that are inside. Okay, and we've got a file server, but ultimately you probably are aware that in the past it was always this mindset of do it yourself, host your own server. So your companies might have a file server, but then they might also have a they might have a SQL database server that users need to access. Let's create that SQL. All right. Maybe Microsoft Exchange. That was email, right? Microsoft Exchange was used for email, and then maybe even like SharePoint was very popular. by Microsoft on premise. So here you've got these, these 4 servers providing a service to our devices, and you've got users working from home and everything else needing to get access to those. Let me just kind of move those a little bit over here, make a little bit of room here, and I'm going to shrink those down just a little bit as well. All right. So this user who is working from home needs to access these services, but the person is not, not around. Well, let me tell you what you shouldn't do. You shouldn't just open up all the ports on the firewall and allow this person in to get access to these devices unsecurely. In fact, in the 90s, a lot of companies did that. The very first company I ever worked for, back in the 90s, they didn't really have a firewall, so you literally could share out you had a public address, and you could connect to it from home. It was really scary when I think about it. Even in the 90s, that was scary, but nowadays it's incredibly scary. Why is it scary? Because you got these people out there that want to do things that they shouldn't do, and get access to companies' data and try to do damage and ransom and all of that, ransomware and all that. And who are these people? Well, we generally call them hackers, right? So let me draw a little hacker. This little box here is going to represent my hacker. All right, and let's make this hacker look like he's up to no good. All right, I'm gonna give him let's give him like a devil horns, some devil horns here, and maybe he's in a bad mood. I'll give him a frowny face, and give him some fangs, and maybe the fangs are dripping blood okay, no, I'm just kidding. Sorry, sometimes I get carried away. All right, but anyway, that's going to be my hacker. All right, goofy looking little hacker person. All right, and so we don't want this hacker spying on my user. We don't want this hacker getting access to resources inside. So how do we get around that? Well, usually the way we would do that is you would use a VPN, a virtual private network. So the way you would do that is you could purchase what was called a VPN concentrator, and basically it's a device that allows secure connections in. But in the Microsoft world, we actually had a type of server we could set up called a RAS server, or also known as an RAS server because it stood for Routing and Remote Access Services. But anyway, remote access services is the idea here, and with that we have support for VPN. Now what does that do? This allows this thing called a VPN tunnel to be created, which means that you have this encrypted communications that goes through to that RAS server, and then from there that RAS server allows you to access other resources securely. This hacker will not be able to see the traffic that's flowing through because it's all encrypted. The only thing the hacker would be able to see is that it was going up to this firewall, and that would be it. Wouldn't be able to see what the traffic said. So this is how we would definitely help secure things. Now, the other thing that I want to talk to you about here is what happens when a company needs to have a service that is exposed to the internet. For example, let's say that your company is going to host their own web server, okay? So you set up a web server. All right, maybe this is going to be www.examlabpractice.com or whatever, and people from the internet need to be able to get to it anonymously. Well, how are you going to do that? Where are you going to put that web server? Are you going to put it internally inside the domain like you see here? And the reason that's scary is because you would have to open up port 443, port 80, which is the HTTP ports, to allow traffic to get in, which means not only could somebody out there on the internet anonymously get into this web server, but technically so could a hacker. And if a hacker was ever to gain access over this website by hacking it, then something called pivoting could occur, where a hacker could actually gain access to these other services that are on your network. And so that's where things are really scary. So you definitely won't want to host it internally most of the time, although there was a way to do something called a reverse proxy. I won't get into that right now. But we would probably want to put this outside, right? So we want to put it out here. But there's something else that's a problem on that. If you put it outside that firewall, you don't have to worry about people getting allowing traffic to come in. But the scary thing about that is the fact that this poor web server is now completely exposed to the internet, so with no protection. So the way around that usually is people would get another firewall. So you'd have two firewalls. This first firewall would be called the internal connected firewall, and then this firewall here would be called the external connected firewall. Now this little network between that, we would call that a DMZ, demilitarized zone, or now the more popular term is perimeter network. Okay, so DMZ, perimeter network are basically the same thing. All right. And so now what you would do is you would only open the ports like port 80, 443, 53 for DNS if you put DNS in there, whatever ports there that you need, and now traffic would be able to get to this web server. Okay, and so even if a hacker somehow hacks this web server, you're not going to allow traffic to pass through this firewall and get to these resources. The only traffic that you might allow would be VPN. Okay, and there's a bunch of authentication and all that has to happen to make that work. All right, so that's the idea of remote access and VPNs in a nutshell for you, as well as the concept of DMZ and the perimeter network idea. Now, the final thing I want to look at with you in this video is the idea of virtualization. So I talked about how in the past it was always the mindset was we got to host everything ourselves. We got to have our own little data center. We got to have our we got to have our own servers, file server, SQL, Exchange, SharePoint, all that, and it's all got to be hosted by us. And that's the way things have always been done. All right. Now, then what you'll find is as time went on, a company called VMware came out with a way of expanding on virtualization. Just so you know, virtualization is not a new term. Virtualization has been around for a very long time. In fact, the term hypervisor is essentially the software that lets us emulate hardware. And if you can emulate hardware, you can also store software on that emulated hardware. That's the idea of virtualization. That term hypervisor has been around since the 1970s. The idea of even mainframes dividing up processing time and doing shared computing was a form of virtualization. So this is not a new concept, but VMware, they expanded on this idea, and the thing that they did that really pushed the envelope on all this was that, hey, you don't necessarily need 4 different servers. And here's the other thing. Here's the other crazy thing. If you wanted redundancy for those 4 servers, you'd really need 8 servers, right? You could do clustering those together. So you'd have 8 servers to provide redundancy for those. But with virtualization, I can set up a hypervisor server, 1 server, and virtualize those other servers. Now, in the Microsoft world, we call that Hyper-V. That is the software that does this, Hyper-V, hypervisor. Microsoft's not the one that came up with that. VMware is not the first to ever come up with that. VMware was the biggest contributor to this concept, though, so I do have to give them credit where credit is due. All right, now the other beautiful thing, though, about this is you get a really, really powerful machine. You virtualize your machines on those. You get these things called checkpoints in Microsoft. They used to be called snapshots, and a lot of other companies still call them snapshots, where you can make changes without the worry of breaking anything because you can revert back to before the change was made. The other thing that's wonderful about using virtualization is if I want to have complete redundancy, I don't have to have 8 servers. I could literally, purchase another server and have a copy of the virtual machines on that other server. Now I've only got 2 servers as opposed to having to have a total of 8 servers. Okay, so this is a very powerful feature capability that kind of started everything. Another thing that we got, and this is kind of where you start thinking about cloud computing, is with virtualization comes the term elasticity, which basically means that each of these machines can be given a certain amount of RAM processing power, but here's what's interesting about that. If one of the servers isn't using all of the available RAM that it's been given, it can share it with other servers. So for example, this file server has been given more RAM than it needs, and then SQL needs that RAM. The file server can give up some of that RAM over to SQL, and when SQL's done using that extra memory, it can release it back to everybody It's basically a pool type scenario where it gets released into a pool of RAM and pool of CPU, and they can grow and shrink as they need. And that's the small way of sort of on-premise way of looking at elasticity. Of course, when you get into cloud computing, you'll learn that that can expand across multiple machines across the the board in these big data centers, but not to get into that just yet here. But that's the idea. Hopefully that now helps you with understanding that concept of what virtualization is, and with that is really where cloud computing started to come into play, which I'm not explaining in this video. But hopefully now you have a much better understanding of the concept of the RAS, VPN, as well the DMZ concepts and virtualization. And now in this next section we'll start getting into the concept of cloud services. Now, with the creation of virtualization, this got companies thinking, if we can emulate hardware, we can create these virtual machines, and we can store software on there. We can have operating systems running on that emulated hardware, the operating systems being called guest operating systems. We could technically host these virtual machines for companies for a price as a service. So the idea being, hey, you pay us a fee each month and we'll host your virtual servers, and you don't have to deal with all the headaches of hosting your own data center on premise, and the power that's needed to do that, and the air conditioning that's needed to do that, all the hardware that's needed to do that, as well as the knowledge of how all the hardware works. So this is essentially what a cloud company brings to the table. So various companies like Google and IBM and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, a lot of them already had tons of data centers, these big massive warehouses all over the world that they could support it. Some of these companies, such as Microsoft and IBM and Amazon, and Amazon being one of the biggest and first, decided to open this up to the public for a fee and allow you to host your services in their data centers. So this is where cloud computing really comes into place. This big cloud here is going to represent cloud computing, mainly the Microsoft cloud computing. And of course it's all connected to the internet with incredibly fast, high-speed internet connections, fiber connections, and all of that. So there's some terminology or some acronyms I want to talk a little bit about real fast here as we get into this. First off, in cloud computing there is an acronym we call IaaS. That stands for Infrastructure as a Service. Okay? Infrastructure as a service means that a provider is hosting all of the hardware infrastructure for you, and then they are going to provide you with a way for you to interact with that hardware and utilize their hardware as a service. All right, and this of course is where Azure comes into play, Microsoft Azure. Now, you might pronounce that word different. People have different ways of saying Azure. Some people call it Azure, some people call it Azure, some people call it, I've even heard it called Azure before, Azure. There's various names for it. In fact, years ago when I was first learning Azure, I decided I wanted to make sure I was pronouncing this correctly. So I was like, I'm going to go to watch the developers. So I started watching videos of the developers, the people who created Azure, and I figured I would determine. The very first video I ever watched, the guy was pronouncing the word Azure, so that's how I say it. But what I further learned is that the Microsoft developers don't agree on how to say it either. Some of them say Azure, some of them call it Azure, some of them call it Azure. So anyway, tomato, tomato, pronounce it however you want to pronounce it, okay? But Azure is Microsoft's main IaaS system. What this is Microsoft is going to host, they've got all these data centers all over the world, and they're going to host their hardware so that you can host on top of their hardware your virtual machines or whatever it is. So you can host virtual machines. Microsoft will also allow you to have access to what are called virtual appliances, like virtual firewalls, also virtual load balancing software, because you can get access to what are called VNets, This is virtual networking, so you can create these virtual networks based on TCP/IP that are running your, in their cloud service with virtual machines on it, and then you can put a virtual firewall. So you can almost like recreate what you're seeing here in an on-premise environment. You can recreate that in the cloud. They also provide virtual storage, so you can store data and backup data out there. They support database hosting, all of that. That's all part of IaaS. Now with IaaS, the model for that, for the most part, is you pay for what you use. So there's an algorithm that looks at how much memory, how much processing power, how much storage that's being used, and then you get a fee each month for what you're using. The good news is they do have a calculator that kind of helps you forecast this. And you can even set alarms to let you know if you're approaching a certain budget that you've got on cost. There's a lot of things out there to help you do that. But that's the idea. You pay for what you use. Okay, now there is another couple of terms I want to mention as well. This next term is called Platform as a Service, and then there's a third term called Software as a Service. So Platform as a Service, PaaS, and Software as a Service. Platform as a Service and software. Let me explain software as a service first, because it's pretty easy to visualize, and then I'll explain platform as a service. So the idea of software as a service is basically they have applications that can be hosted in the cloud service, apps, if you will. These apps are 100% ready to use, ready for you to take advantage of. All you got to do is use those applications. Okay. For example, Microsoft has what's called Office for the web, or it used to be called Office Online. So that's like Microsoft Word, Excel, PowerPoint. You can run it from within your web browser. All you got to do is just jump right in and use it. So from an admin standpoint, all we have to do is assign the users that are allowed to use that, and they can go use it, and it's available to them 100%. All they got to do is start using it. There's not really a lot of administration for us. Now, what is Platform as a Service? Well, Platform as a Service is a system in which the majority of the configuration is done for us, but we still have some admin configuration we have to do to use it. For example, with virtual machines, this is 100% IaaS. A virtual machine you can put whatever operating system on there, but you're responsible for the operating system. You're responsible for the software that goes on it. You as an admin have to manage all that. Okay. With Platform as a Service, virtual machines are set up in the background that you don't have any control over. They've already put the operating system on there. They've already put the software on there. You don't have any control over any of that. But there's still some administration you have to do in order to control it. For example, Microsoft has a directory service called Azure AD. Now, this is a big deal. This is probably one of the biggest deals of the things I've gone over so far in this cloud. Azure Active Directory is what we call a platform as a service. It is a directory service that is sort of the cloud version of what you have here called ADDS. So, now I remember when I first heard about Azure Active Directory, I thought, oh, well, this is just like you're just hosting virtual domain controllers in the cloud. No, they have completely redone the concepts of Active Directory. It is completely redone with all new web-based programming languages. It does not use any of the dated stuff like LDAP and Kerberos and all that. It uses industry standard authentication protocols in order to support all the latest and greatest features and capabilities in the cloud. Okay, and so these are where users, passwords, all of that stuff is going to be managed in the cloud. But it starts out with almost nothing in it. So it's ready to use, but you as an admin have to start creating users and all of that. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, what if I want to use my on-premise users in the cloud? Well, stand by, I'll explain that in a second. Anyway, Azure AD is a platform as a service. So is, here's another one, Exchange Online. Microsoft has Exchange Online. That is actually both a platform as a service and a software as a service, in that the admin side of it is the platform as a service, but the user side is the software as a service. Same thing for SharePoint Online. Microsoft has SharePoint Online as well. Same idea there. All right. And then you've got Microsoft Teams. That's the admin side of that is a platform as a service, but the user side of that is a software as a service. There is OneDrive for Business. That's a cloud storage that we have access to that allows users to store their data out there in the cloud. There is a product called Intune, which is Microsoft's MDM product. MDM, it's also MAM product, so it's both. Mobile device management, that allows us to manage devices. This is one of the most powerful things we have available to us. This is what sort of is replacing the concept of GPOs. This is going to allow us to manage our device settings. Not only can we manage on-premise devices, but we can manage mobile devices. GPOs can only manage devices for Windows. With Intune, we can manage Windows, Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, all that stuff. With the help of Intune, we can manage the settings and restrictions. We can deploy software. This is a very, very powerful product, okay, that we have available to us. It even has a thing called Autopilot, which will allow us to reconfigure Windows machines and all of that. So very, very powerful stuff that we have available to us. All right. Now, I will tell you that Azure has, Azure definitely has some of the, it has some platform as a service technologies and some software as a services technologies, but the main type of system that Microsoft has created for platform as a service and software as a service is called Microsoft 365. Okay, Microsoft 365. All right, which I forgot to add to my display here. We actually do have apps that are called the Microsoft 365 apps. All right, which formerly they would call them Office 365 apps. They're now, starting to call them Microsoft 365 apps. But the Microsoft 365 services it is a cloud service that basically sits on top of Azure. So you have Azure in the background of all this, and the Microsoft 365 sitting on top of it. All right, you can't have a Microsoft 365 account or tenant that doesn't also have Azure. Azure is in the background no matter what. And the other thing to be aware of is both of these share Azure AD. So you'll notice that there are web portals for creating users and things through Microsoft 365 or creating users through Azure. It all ties back to Azure AD. You're going to see the same users no matter what. So these two things are glued together basically. Okay, they're glued together. Now on Microsoft 365 with PaaS and SaaS and all that, you're not really going to be hosting virtual machines, but you're going to be working with these services. Let's just kind of color code some of this real quick. All right. Now again, I do want to add that Azure does have PaaS and SaaS services that I'm not getting into right now, but it's mainly an IaaS based service. That's its main focus. Microsoft 365 is strictly PaaS related and software as a service, SaaS related. It doesn't really have any virtual machines or any of that, though it can interact with them. Okay, so if I was to sort of draw a circle around some of these, all of this stuff you see here would be Azure related, and then all of this stuff you see right here would be the Microsoft 365 related. Now, they both share Azure AD, so I'm going to put a purple circle around that. Red and blue make purple. All right, and so they all link to that. Okay, and so that is how Microsoft handles those concepts. The other thing about Azure's, with Azure, you're paying for the CPU, RAM, storage you use. With Microsoft 365, it's all based on licenses. So you purchase these subscriptions that have a certain amount of licenses, and you issue these licenses out to your users, and your users can take advantage of these various features. Okay. One more thing I want to explain here, and that is, what about the issue of what if we want to use our on-premise users to access resources in Azure? Well, Microsoft has a solution for that. They actually have a type of server that you can set up, and the server is called an Azure AD Connect server. Azure AD Connect. Now, what does this do? An Azure AD Connect server, this is a synchronization-based system, and what it will do is it will allow my on-premise users to be synchronized out to Azure AD. Now, it does not allow Azure AD users to be synced in, only out, but it will allow user passwords and all of that to be synced in. So if a user is logging on to Azure AD and they change their password out in the cloud, it does have the ability to synchronize that password back in. But the beauty of this is by going this route, if you have this on-premise environment, you can achieve what we call SSO. What is SSO? Single sign-on. The idea of single sign-on with all of this is my user can sit down at their on-premise computer, they can log on, and it's going to log them on both in the cloud as well, it's going to log them on-premise as well as in the cloud at the same time. All right, and they can access resources out there. The other thing I'll tell you is that Microsoft has moved into a way to where you could technically not even have a domain nowadays. You don't necessarily have to have a domain. In fact, it pains me to say this as a consultant because, I have fed my family for, 2 decades by using Active Directory, both teaching it as well as, consulting on it. But I'll be honest, Microsoft is now moving in a direction to where domains are not even needed anymore. They're now making it possible to where everything can be managed through your cloud service and domains are not needed. But if you're a company that's already got a domain and all this is still in place and all of that, then this Azure AD Connect server is going to be the thing that's going to help you. Okay? All right. Well, hopefully this has now helped you have a better understanding. This was really just a fundamentals video to help you understand the cloud service, the concepts of it, and I hope that this has been helpful to you. Then I want to talk about some of the differences of the concepts between Azure AD, the on-premise ADDS, the Azure hosted ADDS, and then we're also going to get into something called Microsoft Entra in this. So first off, you've seen this drawing before. This involves the understanding the foundations of your on-premise Active Directory. So again, we started out, for the last 20 some odd years, we have had this triangle here, which is, our actual on-premise ADDS. What is ADDS? That is Active Directory Domain Services, right? And this is an on-premise based directory service. It is built off of the LDAP protocol, which is Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It uses an authentication protocol called Kerberos. It allows us to use GPOs and manage our devices and all that on-premise. It's a great on-premise solution. Now, the downside, of course, is that it is a bit dated. It doesn't support all the latest and greatest web-based authentication systems and all of that. Now, as Microsoft has moved into the cloud, they introduced Azure AD. Azure AD is Azure Active Directory, and with Azure Active Directory, it is a web-based directory services infrastructure that allows us to authenticate users out in the cloud. In fact, we can use Azure AD without even having an on-premise Active Directory domain services. In fact, as a consultant, a lot of the companies that I do business with now, I generally don't even recommend setting up an on-premise Active Directory services unless you just really want to host your own data center and manage servers and all that. I generally just recommend using Azure AD. Okay, now Another solution, now you might run across this fact that you may say, well, what about a company? Imagine this situation, everybody. Imagine the situation where you have a company that has built a bunch of custom apps and custom programming code that was built specifically for on-premise ADDS. And they're not ready to leave that yet. They're not ready to get rid of all that yet. However, the company does want to get rid of on-premise servers. Maybe they're wanting to completely get rid of their on-premise servers and move directly into the cloud. What would you do then? Well, Microsoft actually has what is called Azure ADDS. So that is a version of Active Directory Domain Services that's hosted in the cloud for you. So if you were in a situation where you absolutely had to keep ADDS, the old LDAP-based standards, you can actually host ADDS in the cloud, in Azure. All right? And you could migrate all of this stuff over. So if you needed to migrate this specialized LDAP code and all of that, you needed to move that into the cloud, you could totally do that. All right. So that is a solution for dealing with that. Okay. So that is Azure ADDS. All right. Now what I want to do, I just want to jump over to the portal. We're going to take a look at that. I'm also going to introduce you to Microsoft Entra. Now, looking at these services in the cloud, first off, if I'm here on portal.azure.com, I can click the menu button and I can go right here to Azure Active Directory, and this is, of course, where I can manage my users and groups and all that stuff right here in the cloud for Azure Active Directory. And if I wanted to link my on-premise domain into the cloud, I can utilize what is called Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect, it's something I can download, I can install on a server in my on-premise network, and then I can synchronize, which I'm not really getting into in this video, but you can do that, and that would let you set up a hybrid solution. So this is Azure AD. This is the way they want nowadays. They want you to be managing your identities and all that. They want you to be using Azure AD. Now, if you did want to host Azure ADDS, that's Azure Active Directory Domain Services, just like you had on-premise if you wanted to host that type of LDAP-based directory service in the cloud, you can actually go to the menu button here. You can go to All Services. You're going to search for Azure AD Domain, there it is right there, Azure AD Domain Services. You would click on that, and then you would go and you would create this resource. Now, I'm not going to be demonstrating that whole thing. I just wanted to get into that concept with you of what that is. So as you can see here, Azure AD Domain Services provides managed domain services such as domain join, group policy, LDAP, Kerberos, NTL, and all those things that we had in our on-premise network would be available if you had the Azure AD Domain Services resource hosted in Azure. Okay. Now, what about this thing called Microsoft Entra? Okay. So Microsoft Entra, the goal of Microsoft Entra, this is a relatively new concept, and it's basically trying to do a unified approach to the different directory services that we have in our different environments. That would be Azure, but not just Azure. There's a whole other portal for this too that I want to show you. So to get to that, I'm going to go to entra.microsoft.com. So there's a whole new portal here that they've created. And the goal of Entra is, imagine if you're in a mixed environment, okay? So you're not just dealing with Microsoft Azure, but maybe you're also dealing with like Amazon Web Services and perhaps other cloud solutions. And you need to have a unified approach to dealing with all this. I worked with a government agency one time, a state agency here in the United States that was in that kind of situation. They had a Azure environment, but they also had AWS. And so what if you're trying to have unified management so that you could authenticate user accounts to both places simultaneously. So that is what this is for. You can see here when you get in here, you have all your Azure AD stuff here. I've got my users and groups and all of that, just like I do if I go to Azure AD. I've also got what's called permissions management. Now, when you go to permissions management, you're going to notice it'll pop up another little portal, and this is something that you actually have to go through, and it's a licensed-based system that's going to allow permissions from other services such as Amazon, which I'm not getting into here. It's a license-based thing. You just need to know what it is here anyway. And then also you do what's called verified ID. Verify ID allows credentials from other services such as Amazon Web Services to authenticate with Azure as well. So this is something else that we could introduce into our environment. Okay, so again, Microsoft Entra, the big thing to remember about it is a unified approach to dealing with credentials that involves not just Microsoft, but also being able to be associated with other services. That's other cloud services such as Amazon Web Services, but also if you had other other web-based apps hosted somewhere like maybe GoDaddy or something like that, you could support authentication between Azure and those other web services. So that is the idea of Microsoft Entra. I'd like to now go over the concept of managed identities in Azure. Now, managed identities is going to be a situation in which you have different services that need to get access to various Azure resources. For example, imagine you have a SQL database that's hosted in Azure and you have a virtual machine that consistently needs to get access to that SQL database, for maybe that virtual machine is a web server. And you don't necessarily want to create a specific user account and assign that virtual machine to that user account, because if that virtual machine ever gets deleted, that user account is still available. So this is where managed identities are going to really come in handy. So to do this, there's going to be a little bit of setup. I'm going to set this up real quickly here. I'm going to go to the menu button here on portal.azure.com, go to resource groups, and I'm just going to create a resource group here, and I'm just going to call this managed identity demo. Okay, and that'll be the name, East US. Click review and create. Click create. All right, I've got my resource group created now. Okay, I'm going to go here to the menu. I'm going to go to SQL databases, and I'm going to click to create SQL database. All right, and we'll specify our resource group, which is Managed Identity Demo, and we'll call this, I'm just going to call it SQL Demo DB, and then it wants a server, so we'll click Create, and the server name must be unique, so I'm going to call this SQL DB Server ELP for Exam Lab Practice. Of course, if you were doing this as well, you'd need to make sure that you name it something unique. All right, so from there, using Azure AD, select our admin. I'm going to make myself the admin. All right, and we'll click OK. And scroll down. Okay, it says compute plus storage, the standard. Again, point of this video is not really to get into the explanations on all the SQL databases and all that stuff. The point is just to show you how to set this up. All right, how to set up a managed identity, not to get into all the depth of SQL right now. All right, so we'll go with that. We'll go configure database, and so you can, I'm just going to go with, let's see, general purpose. Yeah, we'll just do basic here. Yeah, and we'll set maximum size since we're not really configuring this full blown. Okay, I think we've done everything. Let's click review and create, and click create. Let's set up our little server that's going to host our SQL database. So we'll give that just a moment to create. Now I'm going to go to the menu button and click on, I'm going to create a virtual machine. So we're just going to go here to virtual machines, click create Azure virtual machine. All right. Resource group will be Managed Identity Demo. I'm going to call this, let's see, Win Server ID Demo. All right. East US, not going to worry about redundancy. Again, point of this video is not really get into the depth of virtual machines and all that. It's just to create one real quick that we can take a look at. All right. Okay, so we're just going to go with that. ELP demo, or I'll call it ELP admin for my username. Set my password for the VM. All right. Uh-oh, got to fix that. There we go. Everything else should be good. Standard HDD. I don't think there's anything else. I am going to make it shut down at 7 p.m. That's fine. Click review and create. And once that's done validating, we are going to go ahead and create. Oh, we've got to fix something. Let's go back. Let's see what we got to fix here. Everything's good here. Nothing else here. Good there. Let's try that again. Okay. Yeah, I think I was just moving too fast for the portal actually. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and click to create. And I'm going to pause the recording while that's getting created. All right, now that the VM is created, the first thing we're going to do is go to the resource itself, go to the virtual machine. You're going to notice there's a blade called Identity. We're going to click on the Identity blade, and here it is right here. You'll notice there's an option that says a system assigned. It says a system assigned managed identity is restricted to one per resource, and it's tied to the life cycle of this resource. You can grant permissions to the managed identity by using role-based access control. Ultimately, what they're saying is that I can set the system identity up by turning this on and clicking Save. I'm going to go ahead and turn that on. It's now registering that with Azure AD. What's great about the system identity is if I give it access to something like the SQL database and the scenario comes up to where the virtual machine is ever deleted, then this system assigned identity is deleted as well, automatically. So it's not like a user account where you create it and then you have to go back and delete the user account later or something like that, like a traditional service-based identity system. So this is what a system identity is going to do for us. All right. So now I'm going to click the menu button and I'm going to go down here to my resource groups, and we'll click on the managed identity demo, and we're going to click on our SQL Server ELP right here. And then from there we have this blade called IAM. We're going to click on IAM, and we're going to click Role Assignments. All right, and then I'm going to click Add a new role assignment, and let's do let's say Contributor, and we'll click Next. And then for members, this is the thing that's important. I'm going to select Managed Identity, select Members. All right, I'm going to drop down and choose right here where it says Virtual Machine. There is my identity that I created a second ago. I'm going to click that, and we're going to click Select. We're going to click Review and Assign, and we're going to click Review and Sign again. And at that point, we pulled the trigger, and we've officially set up that identity assignment for that SQL database server. So now that we've done that, I want you to imagine another scenario. Imagine that you're not just dealing with one virtual machine that needs access to this database. Maybe you're dealing with maybe 4 or 5 or 10 virtual machines that need access to this database, and you don't want to have to do separate identities for each virtual machine. So what you can actually do is you can create a individual managed identity that all of them can use simultaneously. Let me show you how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to go home, and now what I'm going to do is click the menu button. We're going to go to All Services, and we're going to search for the term Managed, and you're going to see Managed Identities right there. As you can see, we don't have a managed identity. We're going to click to create a managed identity. I'll just store it in my managed identity demo resource group. Okay, we'll do East US, which I passed it. There it is. and I'm just going to call it My Managed ID. That'll just be the name of it. We'll click Review and Create. We'll click Create. Alright, so now it's going through the process of creating that managed identity. After that managed identity is complete, we're going to go to our virtual machine. Okay, click on the virtual machine here. We're going to go down here where it says Identity. From there, we're going to go to User Identity. Click Add User Assigned Managed Identity. There's the one we just created. We're going to click Add to that. And there you go. Now, all we got to do is go over to our SQL database. So here's the menu. We're going to go to Resource Groups. Click on Managed Identity Demo. Go to our SQL Server here. Go to the Access Control IAM. Role Assignments Add Role Assignment. Alright, we'll say Contributor. Click Next. Managed Identity. Select Members. And we'll go there and select User Assigned Managed Identity. Select it. Click Select. Review and Assign. And we've now officially done that. Now again, what's great about this is if we just want to lose connectivity with all those virtual machines, we have multiple virtual machines that were using that same identity, we can just disable access using that managed identity, and that'll disconnect all of them from having access at that point. So that is the difference as far as using, again, the system-based identity method versus a user-managed identity. So again, if we go back over to our virtual machine, we go back to this virtual machine real quick and go back to identity, you'll see you had two options there. You had a system assigned, which you can only have one of those, right? You only have one system assigned per virtual machine. But alternatively, if you had multiple virtual machines, you could do the user identity. It's a few more steps, but it's another solution that would get the job done. I want to now take a look at how we can create users inside our Azure environment. So, of course, in Azure, we have a directory services known as Azure AD. Okay, a lot of people think that Azure AD is just like on-premise Active Directory, but maybe handled through virtual machines in the cloud, but that's actually not the case. Azure AD is a newer system than the on-premise Active Directory that was created back in the year 2000, or I should say before that, because it was in beta for a while. But with Azure AD, it is a fully functional cloud-based directory services that can hold our different users, groups, and handle authentication with passwords and other multi-factor authentication-based systems and all that. So we're going to look at how we can create user accounts in Azure Active Directory. So to begin with, here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to look right here in the upper left-hand corner, and there's this little symbol right here, the 3 lines. A lot of people call that the menu button. Some people call it the hamburger. I guess it's supposed to look like, you know, 2 pieces of bread and a piece of meat. I always just argue that IT people just love to talk about food, so maybe that's it. I don't know. But another option for getting to Azure AD, you can go over here to right here where it says Azure Active Directory. But I tend to like to be in the habit of using the menu button because you're not always going to be on this screen. So I'm going to go to the menu button here, and you will look down here and see these here are called blades. All right. Another interesting name that they give things here, but this is called a blade. So we're going to click on the Azure Active Directory blade, okay? At that point, we are now in Azure Active Directory, and we can go over here to the Users blade, and this is where we can begin creating user accounts, all right? So from there, now you might notice that I have a bunch of user accounts in my little environment here just because I've some of my other courses I've created some users, but you can ignore those. You will not have all those users right now, so don't worry about all that. But if I want to create a user account, I'm going to go right here. I'm going to click to create a user, right? So new user, and then I'm going to say create a new user, all right? From there, all I got to do is choose to create a user. I'll explain what invite user is in just a moment, but if I want to create a user, I just go here and specify what I want that user's name to be. Okay. Now, one thing of note, you will notice that my the @ symbol, this is called the user principal name, which is a username and then an @ like an email address type name. You'll see mine says examlabpractice.com because I have registered a custom domain name, which I'm not getting into right now on how to do that. Just know that it is possible to do that. You can register a custom domain name if you want, okay, but we're not getting into the details on that just yet. So I'm just going to create a user named Bob Jones. You can pretty much come up with any name you want here, and just put that in there, and then Bob Jones, first name Bob, last name Jones. At that point, you can do auto-generated password, and if you click show password, you can see what that password is, or you can say let me create the password, which you can create your own password for the user. And then essentially what would happen is you would tell the user what that password is, and then as soon as they log in, Azure Active Directory is going to force them to change the password. You could also assign them to groups. Not getting into groups right now. You can also assign them to roles, which I'm not talking about roles right now either. Although, in a nutshell, groups can give different access to different resources using groups, and with roles you can actually give administrative permissions and things like that. But again, not getting into groups and roles at the moment. From there, you could say block sign in for the user if you want. This means the user will not be able to log on right now. Maybe you just want to create the account, and then maybe you're going to allow them to log on later down the road. Or maybe you temporarily just want to turn a user off. You can actually go into the user's properties and turn this, set this to block later if you want. Then you got usage location. Now, I would like to say, even though I'm not really talking a whole lot about licensing right now, one of the things you do in Azure AD in some cases is you give them licenses to things, especially if you start using Microsoft 365 and you're working with, the Office services, and maybe you're given access to Teams and Word, Excel, PowerPoint, and different products. You'll need to assign them licenses, and it is very important that you associate a usage location. If you don't, you cannot assign any licenses, okay? And the other thing is, and I haven't really gotten into this just yet, but there is licenses involving Azure Active Directory. Right now, when you start out with a free account with Azure Active Directory, you have a free Azure Active Directory license, and then you can upgrade to things like Azure Active Directory Premium 1 or Premium 2 license, which gives you even more capabilities out of Azure Active Directory, which again, I'm not thoroughly explaining licenses right now. I just wanted to throw that out there. The main point I want to get across to you right now is that even though Azure Active Directory will allow you to bypass this and not associate a usage location, it is important that a user does have a usage location. And if you start trying to give the user a license and they can't get a license, it could be because you did not assign them a usage location. So I'm going to go ahead and just put in United States here. All right, and then we could say job title. Maybe Bob Jones is going to be a, let's say that Bob Jones is a help desk level 1. All right, support. All right, help desk level 1 support. That's his title. His department will be IT. All right, company is Exam Lab Practice. All right, and then of course you can also associate a manager to the user if you wanted to, and that way you have the ability to look up who their manager is, and their manager can be given special privileges, which I'm not getting into just yet. All right, so from there, if I want, I can go ahead and click to create, and it says this user has been successfully created. All right, so the next thing I want to show you here is what the invite user is. If I click new user again and I click to create a user or invite user, it really doesn't matter. Either one's going to give you the same options, but you'll notice that if you said invite, it's going to default to invite user. So that is known as an external. You're inviting an external user, also known as a guest. Okay, so in a lot of cases, your company might be working with people that don't necessarily work as an employee for the company. It could be like a contractor, some kind of consultant or something like that. I know for me, I've done consulting work. I've actually done consulting work directly with Microsoft before, and they invited me as a guest to their Azure AD service, and we had meetings and things like that through Teams about the project we were working on and all that. And that's a common practice for a business to, if they want to temporarily give access to a user, this is a great way to do it, especially if the user is not a full-time employee, they're just a consultant or something like that. They're just temporarily working on some kind of a project. This is a great way to handle that. So from there, you would put in, let's say you've got a user. Let's say the user is, we'll do Greg Johnston. All right. And Greg Johnston's email address is gregjohnston@gmail.com. All right. Maybe he's just using his personal email address. So at that point, you would put in that information, and you could send him a personal message like, "Hey, Greg." Oops, does help if you actually can type. "Hey, Greg, please accept this link." Okay, so what'll happen is you can click to invite. It's going to send a link to this user, gregjohnston@gmail.com. They can accept the link. It'll from there it'll let them create a password. They can sign in, and they can be given access to resources. Which again, I haven't really gotten into how we can give access to resources right now. Okay. I'm just simply showing you how you can invite a guest. A guest can be invited. You might say, well, is that guest going to be more restricted or less restrictive? You can actually give a guest user account pretty much the same privileges as a regular user account. The thing is, though, is that with the help of these things called access reviews, guests can be a little bit heavier scrutinized than a regular user sometimes would. And you can periodically have these reviews done on whether or not this person should remain a guest. But I'm not getting into any of that right now. I just wanted to point out that you could. Okay, you're welcome to try this out yourself. You could invite yourself as a guest. If you have a personal email address, you could try inviting yourself as a guest to your own environment and try logging on. That's a good little thing you could give a shot at right now if you wanted to. But then from there, we could continue filling all this out. Groups, roles, block sign-in, usage location, job title, department, company, manager. You're going to see it's pretty much the same thing as creating a user. The only difference is this guest user will get to keep their own personal email address or whatever email address that's put right here. All right. Okay. So the next thing I want to show you, let's go back over here. Go back to the users blade, and so I wanted to show you that we do have the ability to download all of our users to a spreadsheet if we want. We can click download users, and it will basically download it to a CSV file. Okay, if you want to pull that up, you can see all your user information in a spreadsheet. Remember, you're not going to have all these users that I've got. I created these users previously, okay, just in a previous course, but don't worry that you don't have all these user accounts, because you're still going to be able to practice everything that you want here. But the next thing I want to show you is if you go over here to bulk operations, you have a bulk create option, which is kind of interesting. A bulk invite and a bulk delete. So if we go to bulk create, it's going to let us download a spreadsheet. All right, and we can open that spreadsheet up. Let's open that spreadsheet up with Excel. All right, and then what you can do is you can create users based on this CSV file, this comma-separated value file, okay? So they show an example of doing that, like, create Chris Green is the user they use as an example, and then we'll say Chris Green at, and then whatever your domain name is. You might have a name that says .onmicrosoft.com. You'd need to put that in there. In my case, I've registered a custom domain name, examlabpractice.com, so I could put that in, and then I could specify what I want the password to be. Okay, I'll just say, let's just do this little, one of Microsoft's favorite little passwords right there, which I'm not going to leave it that, but that's what it will be right now. And then if I want to block sign in, no, I'm not going to block sign in. And then I could do, first name is Chris, last name is Green, job title is sales manager or something, department is sales, so on and so forth. Then you could go ahead and fill the rest of this out. Now imagine if you had a situation where you had your company recently absorbed another company. Maybe this other company is a smaller company that's got 50 employees or something. And if you had a spreadsheet maybe that was provided by that company's HR department or something, you could build the spreadsheet out like that, like you see on my screen, and then you could actually import all this and have all those users created without having to manually type all that in. So that could really save you a lot of time. Okay, so I've got a Chris Green. Let's also create another one. Let's do Larry Thomas. So Larry Thomas at examlabpractice.com. We'll just do the same password. And again, as soon as a user logs on, it makes them change their password. Larry Thomas. Maybe Larry Thomas is a marketing manager. Okay. He's part of the marketing department, which I just realized that I messed that little up right there, so I'm just going to fix that. All right. And of course, again, you could fill the rest of this out, but I'm not going to do that. All right. So from there, I can go and save this. So we'll just say, save this. I'm just going to save it to my desktop real quick. All right, once it's saved, now I'm going to jump back over into here, and we're going to upload that spreadsheet. Okay. All right, so I selected where it was on my computer, and I'm going to hit submit. And if you've got any errors, it's going to let you know. Okay, hopefully we don't have any errors, and it should be able to create those users successfully. So imagine you had a spreadsheet of 50 people, 100 people, 500 people. This could really cut down on the amount of time. I also use the analogy of it's like, imagine a school university and they've got enrollments with a lot of students starting, and maybe they got an enrollments department that collects all the student data through a spreadsheet. You would be able to use that to your benefit. You wouldn't have to go through and do all the clicks. So let's go ahead and try refreshing, and let's see if our users are there. So there is Chris Green, and there's Larry Thomas. So it was able to create the users. Of course, another way we can create users that I'm not getting into right now is you can use PowerShell. There's also Azure CLI, which it's based on Linux. If you're familiar with Linux, the Azure CLI commands will be used, but I'm not showing you how to do that just yet. I just wanted to show you how you could do all this graphically. So as you can see, very easy to jump right in and create user accounts. Also invite users as guests using the Azure portal. I now want to take a look at creating groups using Azure Active Directory. Okay, now just be advised that you will need to utilize some of the functionality in groups. You will need to make sure your Azure Active Directory Premium 2 license is activated. And I've shown you how to do that in a previous video. Just make sure you've done that, and remember that it can take up to from 15 minutes up to an hour for that to actually take effect. But either way, you should be able to, if you're trying to follow along, you should be able to do the majority of the stuff here that I'm doing even without that license. All right. So here we are, portal.azure.com. We're going to go to the menu button. We're going to go to Azure Active Directory blade here. And then from there, we're going to click the Groups blade. And this is where we can create groups. Now, again, you might notice that I've got a bunch of different groups here. You will not have all those right now. Just don't stress over that because you create your own groups. These are some groups that I had from a previous course that I built, okay? But don't worry that you don't have all those groups. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and click to create a new group, all right? And from there, we have group type. Now, there are two kinds of groups that Azure AD will natively support. You have what is called a security group, and you have what is called a Microsoft 365 group, okay? Now, let me just start by explaining what a Microsoft 365 group is, just because that's a very common one that's used in your business services, especially, of course, if you are using Microsoft 365. So if your company is using Microsoft 365 licenses, so you've got maybe Office and you're using Teams and you got all these different application services and stuff that you're using. And of course, we're not really looking at all that stuff right now in this video, but if your company is using that, those types of services, this is the preferred group, because when you create a Microsoft 365 group, you have the ability to essentially assign users to that group, and those users will essentially be tied together in a certain way. For example, in that group, it will automatically create a team for Microsoft Teams, so the users that are in that group will automatically be associated with Microsoft Teams. They automatically can have a SharePoint site set up for sharing information through SharePoint. Microsoft Planner, there's a thing called social media platform called Yammer they're all associated with. They get an email address associated with that group, so if you email the group, the email will go to everybody in the group. You can also give the group permissions to resources and things like OneDrive and all of that. All right. Now, there is one major thing that this group cannot do, and that is it cannot contain devices. It can only contain users, and that is something that I would recommend you remember. Microsoft 365 groups cannot contain devices, so you can't put laptop, desktop computers in this group. You can't put smartphones, tablets, anything like that in this group. It can only contain user accounts. All right. And if you're just talking about pure Azure services and you're not doing a lot with Microsoft 365, you generally would want to go for the other group. All right, the security group. All right, so the majority of the stuff we'll do here and play around with is going to involve using a security group if we're just doing pure Azure related services and we're not dealing with the Microsoft 365 licenses a whole lot. In other words, we're not playing with Teams, we're not doing Exchange or any of that stuff. Okay, so a security group. Security groups are built specifically for giving rights out to things. So for example, if you're going to be setting up virtual machines and giving certain people, individuals, access to the virtual machines to play around with it, or other resources in Azure, and you're giving permissions out for that, this is the more common group, because it's not really related to dealing with Microsoft Office and all that fun stuff. And very critical, if you are going to be associating devices to this group, you have to use a security group for that. So let's create a security group. I'm going to call this security group developers. All right, maybe we've got a group of users that are developers. Maybe they're developing applications for our Azure environment. And so we're going to have this group called developers. You can specify a description. Right here, you can also associate Azure AD roles to this group. Roles are going to give certain permissions out. Not really going over roles right now, so I'm not going to select anything there. And then you can do membership type, either assigned, dynamic user, dynamic device. Okay, so this is where it's important. If you don't have the Azure AD premium subscription set up, you will not have the dynamic user, dynamic device. Okay, but let me explain what all this is. So an assigned group is a group type that you have to either add or remove people to and from that group. Okay, so this will involve me as an admin adding people to the group manually or removing people out of the group manually. Or alternatively, we can also have what's called a group owner, and if we assign a group owner, then that group owner can add people to the group or remove people out of the group. Okay, so generally speaking, it's a very static group. People get added or removed manually by somebody, either an admin or by a group owner. Okay, now that is the generally just how normal groups, if you got a free Azure AD subscription, you'll always have that option. But with the premium, you get the ability to use dynamic user, dynamic device. And notice, by the way, that if I go to Microsoft 365 group, I do have the ability to do a dynamic user group, but not a dynamic device group, because remember, we cannot associate devices with a Microsoft 365 group, only security groups, right? So from there, I could go, let's do a dynamic user group. Now, I will also say that you can still assign an owner to this. An owner can configure certain settings for the group, but with dynamic groups, no person will ever be manually adding people to the group or removing people out of the group. Dynamic groups are really interesting. They use these things called dynamic queries. And the only way something is part of the group is by this thing called a dynamic query, okay? So for example, if I go over here and click Add Dynamic Query, all right, from there I've got these different expressions. These expressions are like conditions that have to be met, and based on those conditions, the device or the user, in this case it's a user because I did a user group dynamic rule here, based on that expression, the device or the user in this case will be part of that group. Okay, so I'm going to go here to property. I'm going to click. So I have all these properties that it can look at in regards to a user. Okay, so we'll do department, and operator will say contains. So that's like their department property contains the word, we'll say developer. Okay, and by the way, this is not case sensitive. All right, so it doesn't matter if I put a capital D or a lowercase d. Now watch this. I can also say, we'll say add in another expression. We'll say and or. We'll say or, and we'll say job title. So if their department property has the word develop in it, contains the word developer, or maybe the job title contains the word developer, either one of those will automatically make this person part of the group. Okay, so at that point, we'll click Save, and we've created ourselves a little dynamic rule here, and we can click to create, and we've now got ourselves a dynamic group. Okay, on the flip side of that, if you want to create an assigned group too, just to play around with that, we'll create an assigned group called Help Desk. All right, and we'll do an assigned group, and we won't worry about having owners or any of that. We'll just click create. And so if we come down here to sometimes it takes a moment to show up and you have to refresh the screen, but let's do that again. Hopefully it's here. No, we're still waiting on it. Let's look at developers first, since we're waiting on that to appear. We'll go to developers, and then from there we'll look at members, and you'll notice that add members is grayed out. Okay, so people will be a member based on the information in their property of that user. So if I wanted a user really to be a member of this group, I'd have to go and edit based on these dynamic membership rules, right? And those are our dynamic membership rules. So if I went back over here to, let's go home, let's go to the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory, users, and let's choose a user. Let's do Larry Thomas here, and we'll go to edit properties. All right, and if we scroll down, he's part of marketing. Let's just change that to developer. Okay, and we'll hit save. So we'll say that I put that he's a marketing manager, but we're just gonna change that. All right, just so you can see how this will work. We'll say for job title, he is a lead developer. All right, now either one of these, you didn't have to do both, because remember we used an or statement on those conditions we were setting, but either one of those would automatically make him be part of this group. All right, but the one thing I also want to point out with Azure is you got to be patient with Azure. Things do not take effect immediately. Sometimes when you make changes like this, it can take about 15 minutes before it actually appears. So if you click groups right now, it actually happened really quick. This case, it did happen very quickly, but just so you know, sometimes it can take up to 15 minutes for something like that to happen. And you're going to hear that a lot when working with Azure. Some things can be instant, some things can be 5 minutes, some can be 10, 15, some can be an hour, and there are even some things that can take 24 hours before they take effect. So that's one of the things you got to consider whenever you're working with Azure Active Directory, or Azure in general, I should say. So let's go back over to groups. So if we go over here to developers, we can click members, and we can see Larry Thomas is part of that group. All right, but notice we can't add or remove people from the group. Okay, now if we go back over to here and we look at Help Desk, which has finally appeared, you'll notice I can, if I go to members, I can manually add people to the group if I want. So because this is an assigned group. All right. So hopefully that gives you a decent understanding now of working in groups. Obviously, you can create groups through PowerShell and the Azure CLI, which is the Linux type shell that Azure has, but I'm not getting any of that right now. I just wanted to show you how we could do this using the graphical tools. I now want to talk about a feature known as administrative units. Now, if you've got some experience with Active Directory on-premise, or ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services, you might be familiar with a feature called OUs, organizational units. And one of the great things we could do with our on-premise Active Directory OUs is we could put users inside of an OU, an organizational unit, and we could delegate control over the resources that was in that unit. Now, administrative units are similar to that concept, but there are some differences. Ultimately, though, the point of an administrative unit is it allows us to sort of categorize our objects together, and then we can delegate control over those objects to certain admins using roles. So, for example, if my organization was broken up into different offices, like maybe I've got New York City, and maybe I've got Atlanta, Georgia, and maybe I've got Los Angeles, or you start getting into like Europe, maybe you're talking about London and Paris, and all these different places. You might have certain administrators that are designated control over those areas and those resources, and maybe the users that utilize those resources. So this is what an administrative unit is all about. So the way I can do that, I can manage that, is I can go here to portal.azure.com, click the menu button, go to Azure Active Directory. All right. And then from there, I have a blade called Administrative Units. Okay, so I'm going to click on that. And one thing you can do, you can click Learn More, which is always helpful because you can kind of skim through some of the documentation. But a couple things here, they give some examples of doing this. In this case, you're looking at, they've broken their administrative units up into School of Business, School of Engineering, security teams, executive teams, talking about maybe some kind of university type scenario. And then you got admins that are designated control over that. Now, ultimately, though, one of the things to understand here is the licensing requirements. You must have at least Azure AD Premium 1 in order to do this. Now, in my environment, I have Premium 2, so I am perfectly fine to do this. If you don't have a premium license, it will let you create an administrative unit. You just can't populate it with anything, so it's kind of pointless, really. You got to have at least that Premium 1 license, okay? But let's go ahead and let's take a look at doing that. So I'll just jump back over here. I'm going to click Add. I'm going to create a administrative unit called NYC, all right, for maybe New York City. All right, from there, I can click Next to assign a role. Okay, so maybe I'm going to allow somebody who is a user administrator. I want a user administrator to have the ability to manage any user that's associated with this role, right? Or with this administrative unit. So in other words, if I had, let's say I had 50 users that were part of New York City, okay? If I put 50 users inside that administrative unit, then I could delegate a certain user to have what's called user administrator authority over that administrative unit. And they would be able to create and manage users. And you have all these other roles. I'm not getting into what all these roles are right now. You can kind of see what the descriptions are of these, but basically what I'm wanting to do is I'm wanting to give admin rights over a certain user. Okay, so from there I could do that, but I'm going to go ahead and create the role first. The administrative unit first. Let's create the administrative unit. So we got one called NYC. Let's create another one called ATL, maybe for Atlanta. Okay, all right, so we'll click that, review and create, and we've created two. So from there I can go to NYC. All right, and I can click to see what users are part of NYC. So if I can click Add, and maybe we'll say that Bob Jones is part of NYC, okay? And then if I go over, let's go back over here to ATL, and we'll say add a member to users, and we're going to do, let's do Larry Thomas. Now, let's just pretend that I've got 50 users in Atlanta listed here, and I've got 50 users in New York listed here. So now what I can do is I can go to Roles Administrators, and I can assign, say, the user administrative role. I could give that role over to a certain individual, okay? So a certain person could be given that user administrative role if I wanted over that. Okay, so any of these users you could assign it, and that's really what you're getting out of this. Now, you might recall an on-premise Active Directory with OUs, organizational units. A user couldn't be part of multiple OUs. A user could only be in one OU at a time. If you don't believe me, try it. Okay, a user could only be part of one organizational unit in on-premise Active Directory. Now, that's one thing that's very different about administrative units. In an administrative unit, a user could technically be a member of both of these if we wanted them to be. Of course, if you're going to do that, you probably wouldn't have called it New York City or Atlanta if you're talking about, you know, offices. Now, if you broke your administrative units up based on departments or something, and maybe you've got a sales administrative unit and then a marketing administrative unit, and you have a user who's a member of both departments, you might have them part of both administrative units. But ultimately, if you're doing it like this, where you're breaking it up into different locations, like I am here, maybe my resources are either tied to New York and my resources are tied to Atlanta, or my users are tied to New York, Atlanta, then I would have maybe an admin or a group of admins that would control either one of these. So that is the idea of an administrative unit. Let's walk through the process now of working with Privileged Identity Management, also known as PIM. Okay, so here we are in portal.azure.com, and I'm going to go to the little menu button here, and I'm going to click All Services, and we're going to search for Privileged Identity Management. All right, and there it is right there. I'm going to go ahead too, and I can just add that as a favorite by clicking the little star icon. So now it'll show up as one of my favorites here in my little menu bar. So I can just click on that, and here we are in PIM, in Privileged Identity Management. All right, and just kind of looking through some of our options here, I've got my roles. If I click on my roles, this is going to show me if I have any eligible roles. Okay, I can click on active roles, and this will show me my active roles. Now you can see I am a global administrator, so that's been assigned, and that's permanent. I'm part of that role, right? So you know, if you go back over to our Azure Active Directory, just standard Azure Active Directory, you can click on your roles, and this is how we traditionally would add users to roles. We can see all the different roles that are available here, right? And I should be able to go through and see the global administrator right here. And the global administrator, I can click on that, and I can see that my user here has been given those rights. Okay, let's jump back over to Privileged Identity Management. All right, and so I've got my roles. You can see that I have active roles. Do I have any roles that have expired? No. Okay, so this is when you go into Privileged Identity Management, if you're clicking on my roles, that's exactly what that sounds like it is. You're looking at roles that your account has, not anybody else, your account. You've got my request. This is if I've requested any roles, okay? And then approve request. This is if I need to approve any request. I don't have any requests to approve right now from any users, okay? So if any users have requested, if you've required a role to be approved, that's where that would happen. You can also click Review Access, and you can see if there's any particular access reviews of a starting time period or an ending time period that have occurred. You'd be able to see those here as well. All right, now here's where things get interesting. All right, I can go right here where it says Azure AD roles. So let's go ahead and click on that. All right, and I've got some options here. I've got assign eligibility. I've got deactivate your role. That's if I had a role that was made available to me, this is where I could activate it. Assigning eligibility, I'm going to look at that with you in a second. That's basically assigning a role. Here's where you would approve request, and then you can also view history of things that have happened through Privileged Identity Management here. So you can click on View History, and you can see previous things. So as you can see here, I've added eligibility to a user and removed eligibility to a user, all that. But let's go back over here now. All right, and let's click on Settings. And you can see all these different settings that we've assigned or modified at the moment. All these different roles, as you can see, it's not showing that I've modified any of these at the moment. So this is what settings is going to do for you when you're looking at it through the AD roles. It's just going to show you if you've modified any. Okay, assignments. All right, I haven't done any assignments, but I could add an assignment if I want. Okay, so if we look at roles, we can see all the different roles that are here. And then I could choose a role like user administrator. We'll kind of go along with that junior administrator example. Maybe I've got a junior administrator, I want to make a user administrator. I can do that right there. I can click on it, I can add assignment that way. So that's one way you can do it. Another way is if you come back over here to Azure AD roles and you go to assignments, you can do it through here as well. So you click to add the assignment, and then of course you've got to specify the role that you want to assign. Okay, so you can do that you can do it either way. You can click on Azure AD roles, you can click assignments, and then it'll make you choose the role. Or if you choose just the roles blade itself, then you can choose the role you want, like user administrator, and you can add the role that way, or add the user to the role. So I can also look at role settings, and I've got all these different settings, like activation maximum duration is 8 hours. You can require justification, require a ticket information on activation. So if you're using a ticketing system, you've got MFA, you can force that on the user. All right. You can allow permanent eligibility, or you can turn that off for the role. Okay. You can have a expiration. So you can actually edit these different settings by just clicking edit, and then you can actually go in and you can modify these settings very easily if you want. Okay. So I encourage you to kind of come in there and peck around. Here's where I could set a duration if I wanted to for a maximum period that this person can get this role in hours if I want. So if I want to, as you can see, it'll let me go, activation of 24 hours if I wanted to set that. On activation, require MFA, require justification. If you got a ticketing system, require approval if you want to approve. You could specify who the person is that's going to do the approvement. Right? So you could set all of that very easily if you want. Like I said, they've made this very intuitive. They made it a lot easier. They've actually improved on it. It used to be a lot harder to deal with a while back, but they've actually done a lot of work to it and made it a lot better. Okay, so let's go through the process. We've got a user named Chris Jones. We're gonna make Chris Jones a user administrator. So I'm gonna go here, and I'm gonna go to roles. And we're going to go down to user administrator, and we're going to click assignment. All right, so the role's here, it's already assigned. We're going to click select our user, and we're going to find Chris Jones. There's Chris Jones, so we're going to select Chris Jones. We're going to click select. He's going to be our junior admin maybe. We're going to click next, and if I wanted to give permanent eligibility, I could, but I don't want to. So I could set a date. I could say, okay, this is going to expire. Notice it sets it to a year. Of course, if you went through settings, you could set it to only be available for 24 hours or something. But you could go through here. It's set to a year right now, but if I don't want to set it to a year, I could. I could go through here and set it to whatever I want. Okay, so if I wanted to go ahead and just say we're going to allow this this person to have access for a few days, we'll say till the 13th, 2020, we'll say assign, and Chris Jones is officially assigned. Okay, so we have officially given Chris Jones access to where he can accept it. All right. And in this next little lesson, I'm actually going to log on as Chris Jones, and we're going to take a look at how Chris Jones would accept it. Okay, so I am about to log on as my user Chris Jones at examlabpractice.com. I went ahead and opened up my browser in incognito mode so that it didn't remember my previous logons, and we could log on as Chris Jones as though we were that user. And we can test out the ability of PIM. Allow Chris Jones to go through and accept that role. Okay, so we're just going to sign in as Chris Jones. Okay, got my password entered. Going to go ahead and sign in now. All right, we'll go ahead and get logged in here. Now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to create a user as Chris Jones. So if we go to our menu bar here, we're going to go to Azure Active Directory. All right, we're going to click on users, and we're going to go and try to create a user. And as you can see, we cannot. Okay, we cannot. It will not allow us to go through and create this user. So we've got to get power to do that. We got to get a role as Chris Jones to do this. So we're going to go over here to the menu bar. We're going to go to all services. We're going to search for privileged identity management right here. Okay. And then from there, we can look at my roles. Okay. Chris Jones has a role that he is eligible for, right? Which is the user administrator. Okay, and it will expire a few days from when we activated it. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and allow this user to activate the role, and we can specify the max amount of time the user can activate the role. Okay, which from our settings that was configured in PIM, that was set to 8 hours. All right, so we can select that. Allow this role to be activated, but notice something, it's going to require additional verification. Okay, so the user is going to have to go through that process of MFA. All right, so at this point we put in a phone number, and it's going to send a code to this number, which of course I have the phone, so I'm going to enter in the code. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and click to verify that. All right, so we've successfully verified MFA, and we are officially ready to activate the role. So we've got this, and then we got to give a reason. This is our justification, and we'll say needed to create new employee user accounts. So we'll put that in, and we'll say activate. So it's going through the process of validating it all, and then it's going to hopefully officially activate it for us. Okay, so it took a minute to activate, then it went away, and from there you're going to notice that my user has this activated. You'll notice that the user has the ability to now go and create a user. So why don't we go and do that? All right. So this was the role that we could activate. If we look at active roles, you can see it is activated. That's the state it's in. So don't get confused, because a lot of times when people see eligible roles, they're like, wait a minute, did it get activated or not? Yes, it did. If you look right here, it's activated. Okay. So now let's go to the menu bar button here. We'll click on Azure Active Directory. And drum roll, here we go. Users, and we can create a new user. So as you can see, it did successfully go through. All right. Well, hopefully that gives you a good understanding now of working with PIM. It's a great feature. It's a relatively intuitive feature, pretty easy to use, and you got to see it from the point of creating the PIM activation for a role, and then you've seen the user go through and add it. So hopefully that gives you guys a good understanding of how that works, and I encourage you now to jump in there and play around with it a little bit, look through some of the settings, and help wrap your brain around PIM. I want to talk now about the concept of conditional access policies. Now, conditional access policies is a feature that is able to sort of connect all the different detection signals that Azure has, and based on some conditions that you can set, these conditional access policies can decide whether or not they're just going to completely block the user and device from connecting, or if they're going to challenge the user in some way, perhaps by forcing multi-factor authentication or something like that to kick in. All right, so let's take a look at what we're talking about here. Here we are on portal.azure.com. We're going to click on the menu button and we're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. From there, we're going to go down to the security blade, and you'll see a blade called Conditional Access. We're going to go ahead and click on that, and then we're going to click to create a new policy. Okay. Now, maybe this is the scenario. Okay. Imagine we have a situation where we have some sales users that maybe work from home in our environment, and it's been reported that some of these sales users are using an older email client that uses something called ActiveSync, and this is seen as a security risk for us, and maybe we would like to either block that, or perhaps maybe we want to enact multi-factor authentication or something along those lines. All right, so this is an email problem. We have some sales users that are using an older legacy application that uses ActiveSync, like some old version of Outlook or something, and we want to, or mobile Outlook, we want to just block them, or we want to challenge them with multi-factor authentication. All right, so I'm going to call this sales ActiveSync policy. All right, and then from there we're going to go down to users, and from there we'll say include only the selected users. So we'll say the selected users are going to be the sales group. Okay, so there is our sales group. We'll select sales. All right, and so then we've got a few options. We could say cloud apps, based on maybe if the users are using specific cloud apps. I could say all, or I could select apps. In this case, you could go through and you could select what apps you want. Now, in this case, with me, I am not actually the ActiveSync and all that is a legacy app, so it's not really going to be seen as a cloud app. But if this policy was going to affect some of the newer style cloud apps like Office 365 and all that, you could select that particular app, and this policy would only be in effect if a user was using that specific app. Okay, but I am not going to select any there. Then we're going to go down here to conditions, and you have user risk. This would be if the user was seen as a risk. So this ties in with what's called Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, and it would be detected if the user was detected as a risk, low, medium, or high, and also if the user was detected to be a sign-in risk. Perhaps Azure has suspected that this user's account's password has been stolen by somebody, and you could have low, medium, or high, and it would base a threat level. So if you selected either of these, this policy would only take effect if the user was currently seen as a low, medium, or high, either sign-in risk or user risk. Okay. And this is not really the lecture. We talk a lot about Azure Identity Protection right now, but that's what those are. All right. This ties in with Azure Active Directory Identity Protection. So we'll go down here to device platforms. This would be if we wanted it to be a specific platform. All right. And maybe this is going to be it is only Windows devices that we've had this issue with. So we'll go with that. We'll say Windows. All right. So then from there, locations would be like particular subnets. You could actually create what are called locations in Azure, and maybe like a particular TCP/IP subnet. You could select that there. Then we have client apps. All right, so this is the one we're actually looking for here. We would say yes, and so you have modern authentication apps. The problem isn't with modern authentication apps; it's with this ActiveSync client. So this is a legacy style email client that can have that could be seen as a security risk, and maybe we want to either block it or enact multi-factor authentication. So we're going to select that. We've got a new feature down here, filter devices, filter for devices. You can actually be a little bit more specific. You can actually select properties of the device like device ID, device name, things like that. You could specify values, but I'm not going to do that in this case. All right, so from there we go down here to grant. This is going to specify whether or not we're going to grant or block. So if I wanted to, I could just simply say block, right? I could also say grant, and then if I wanted to say, okay, we're going to grant access to these legacy, perhaps maybe we have no choice, maybe we absolutely have to have some of these legacy devices using this old ActiveSync client, but we're going to require MFA, okay, if we want to. Or again, we could just say block if we wanted to. You can also do some other things here. Require device to be marked as compliant, so it also have to meet compliance of the company. Require hybrid, if you had a hybrid environment between an on-premise domain. Require approved clients, so you'd have a list of approved clients there. You got require app protection policies if you wanted to implement that with the help of Intune. Require a password change, marketing promo. This is a newer little feature they've got. You require all the selected ones, or you could require one of the selected ones. So in my case, I'm just going to go with this top one. I'm going to hit select. And you've also got this new session feature over here, which we don't really need in this case, but they tell you to control access based on session controls. You can enable a limited experience with specific cloud apps. We're not really doing cloud apps in this case, but you can utilize these little features as well. All right. So at that point, if I want to return this on, I can go ahead and just turn it on. I can have it report only, turn on, or turn off. I'm going to say turn on. Click create, and I've now officially implemented my sales ActiveSync policy. So that is what a conditional access policy would do for you. This is only going to affect the people in the sales group. It would not affect anybody else, and they would have to be using an ActiveSync based client, those older email based clients, for this policy to affect them. And if that was the case, it would force them to use MFA. And if they couldn't use multi-factor authentication and they couldn't authenticate through multi-factor authentication, well, it would just not let them in. They would not be able to utilize, they wouldn't be able to check their email. So this would, this just adds that additional layer of protection, forcing them to use MFA. Again, I could go in there and set it to block if I wanted to. All right, but that's the idea of a conditional access policy. It's a great way to sort of utilize a lot of the different signals that Azure AD is using to detect threats and things like that, and then decide whether or not we're going to block or we're going to allow the user based on certain criteria. We're now going to take a look at the Azure AD Identity Protection System in the portal.azure.com. So to start with, I'm going to go up to the menu bar here, and we're going to go to All Services, and we're going to search for Azure AD Identity Protection. Okay, you'll see Identity Protection show up in the list, and you can go ahead and click on that. Okay, from there, we'll take a look over here on the left at some different blades that are available to us. So the first one is the user risk policy. So we're going to click on that. All right, and these are the parameters that have to be defined for your user risk policy. So first order of business would be to select the users that you're actually wanting to assign this to. Now by default, you can see here I've got all users, but I could add a group of users that I want, and I could add exclusions if I wanted. In my case, I'm going to do all users. So I'm going to leave that the way it is. The second thing is conditions. So we're going to go to conditions, and at this point you select a risk level based upon the actual user that's possibly at risk. So this is a decision that's made based upon all the things that we talked about in that previous video, where it decides whether or not something is a low risk, medium risk, or a high risk. And this is a system and based upon an algorithm that Microsoft has created. Now in my case, I'm going to say high risk. So we're going to be looking for something that's flagged as a high risk. So chances are it is definitely a compromised account. And then we'll hit select, and we'll hit done. From there, we're going to look at the access. And this is going to be what we're going to do. Now we have block or we have allow, but if we choose to do allow, we're going to make the user do a password change. Okay, because chances are if this is a high risk, the user really has had their account compromised and we would require a password change. Or if you just wanted to flat out block the user, you can block the user. Okay, and at that point I would enforce the policy, which is going to turn this on, and I would click save. So as you can see, configuring your user risk policy is pretty easy. Let's take a look at the sign-in policy, sign-in risk policy. So we'll click that. Same kind of deal. You would select your users here, specify if you wanted to do groups. Okay, and I know I've said this previously, but as far as inclusion and exclusions, if you added a group of users to include, and then you added a group of users to exclude, the exclusion will override the inclusion. So if the users are in both groups, the exclusion would essentially take over. Okay, so from there, we're going to go ahead and set our conditions here. We'll set that to high, click select, and then done, and then we're going to go to control access. Now notice with control access here in a sign-in risk, we can choose block or we can choose allow, and if we choose allow, it says require multi-factor authentication. So in other words, if it's considered a sign-in risk, then what's going to happen to the user is they're going to be forced to perform MFA. Keep in mind, if the user does not support MFA, then it's just going to block the user. Okay, so the user does have to be signed up to utilize MFA and have a MFA license in order to do that. Okay, so I'm going to do allow on this one, but I'm going to require MFA. Okay, and then at that point I would enforce the policy, click save. Speaking of which, if you wanted to go further, I know I've discussed MFA, but here's an MFA registration policy you could look at as well. But here's the little reports I was also talking about. So you have risky users. You can see if you've got any risky users that have logged in, and as you can see, I don't. I also have the ability to download this little report if I want. It'll put it in like a little spreadsheet CSV file for you. All right. You can also filter this report. So if you had a very long list of users here that was listed, you could filter, show certain dates, the risky states, all that. So then we've got risky sign-ins right here. This would show you any risky sign-ins that have occurred. Same kind of deal. You can filter if you want. You can export the data, download the data. And then lastly, we have risk detection. So this is going to show everything in general and by default, as you can see, the last 7 days. But of course, if I wanted to, I could alter this, these filters, change this around, and sort by detection time, user, IP address, location, all that stuff if I wanted to. So it's actually really easy to see the different risks that are going on in your environment. Of course, in my little trial environment here, as you can see, I don't have much going on, but I'm definitely in a legit environment. If you actually are managing a Microsoft 365 environment, I encourage you to go and check out these objects here to see what risk you've got in your environment. All in all, I hope you'll find that Azure AD Identity Protection is a pretty easy system to manage and control. Just a matter of going and finding the right blade you're looking for, user risk policy, sign-in risk policy, and enabling the conditions you want. Now, when it comes to Azure and authentication, one of the concerns that people think about here is the fact that you have Azure AD, which is, of course, the online authentication directory services they have. You have Azure ADDS, which is the Active Directory domain services hosted in the cloud. You have third-party authentication services such as Amazon Web Services, and of course you have possibly on-premise authentication, which would be on-premise ADDS, Active Directory Domain Services. And of course, one of the concerns you have there is, what if we've got a mixture of these different services? How is this all going to work? Well, of course, Microsoft, one of the big terms that they've pushed for many, many years, I would even say for the last 20 some odd years, is a term called SSO. SSO is single sign-on. And the idea of single sign-on is that a user should be able to have one identity account, one user account that they're using that they can authenticate with one time and get access to all the services that they need access to. And of course, that is definitely what Microsoft has tried to do. For one, if you do have on-premise Active Directory, you can set up Azure AD Connect. So if I go here to the menu button on portal.azure.com and I go to Azure Active Directory, we have Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is a service that can be installed on a server on-premise, and it can synchronize your on-premise user accounts into the cloud. The other thing is, with Azure AD, you can have Azure AD accounts that authenticate with Azure ADDS as well, and with the new Microsoft Entra services, you can authenticate with services like Amazon and all that. So Microsoft provides us with the ability to allow a user account that can authenticate in all these places at one time, which gives us the single sign-on capabilities. Now, the other thing that Microsoft has started to implement is the ability for multi-factor authentication with passwordless authentication. And well, let's talk about multi-factor authentication first. Multi-factor authentication is the single most powerful capability we can implement in a cloud environment that gives us the ability to basically prevent account breaches. You think about one of the number one reasons accounts get breached in most services is because somebody discovers a person's password. We can implement multi-factor authentication. If I go right here, click the menu button, and go to Azure Active Directory and click on my users, I can go right here, and right here where it says per user MFA, and I can implement multi-factor authentication, all right, for my individual users. All right, so whatever user I've got, like Bob Jones here, I can enable multi-factor authentication for Bob Jones if I want. All right, not only that, if I go over here to service settings, I can control exactly which types of authentication systems that a user can use for multi-factor. Now remember, multi-factor authentication involves not just using a password, but also using it with pairing it with something else. Like for example, I could have call by phone, where when the person goes to log on, they might put a password in, but then it can call by phone, and the user would have to enter a code. They hit a number that basically the phone call tells them to put. Basically, it'd be like a Cortana type voice talking to you. You can have a text message by phone where it sends a PIN number, a one-time password to your phone. You can have a notification through the mobile app or verification code for the mobile app. If you actually go out there and look at what is called the Microsoft Authenticator. If you've never seen it, if you have a phone or tablet in front of you, you can go to the App Store on that, and you can download the Microsoft Authenticator app, whether you've got Android or iOS. And there's two options for that. You have a one-time password that changes every 30 seconds when you go to log on. And then the other option is you can support a pop-up approval message, all right, where it says, do you approve this authentication? Of course, if you go back over here, you'll see right here, you have notification through the mobile app. That's the pop-up message that says, would you like to approve the sign-on? Or you can also do the verification code where it changes every 30 seconds through the app. And then also you can do hardware tokens. Microsoft supports, you can support what's known as a FIDO2 key. These are becoming more popular. It's basically a USB drive like this, and it has to be inserted into a USB of the computer that you're authenticating with into the domain or into Azure. And you can also, of course, support good old smart cards that have been around forever, which is kind of like what the military uses. They use what's called a common access card here in the United States to authenticate. They have a little smart card reader like this that is utilized. All right, so there are these other systems, of course, that can support that authentication, the smart card and FIDO and all that don't require you to enter a password. And you can also use with on-premise Windows machines, you can support what's called Windows Hello for Business, which can do facial recognition and all of that. So there's a few different solutions that Microsoft has added to help us with the different authentication services that we have in Azure. One of the great features that we get with Azure AD is the ability to periodically go through and reevaluate some of the user groups and rights that have been given out within Azure Active Directory. Okay, and this of course works in conjunction with Azure AD as well as our Microsoft 365 services as well. And this feature is a feature called Access Reviews. Now, some of you guys that have been in the IT field for a while, you probably know like one of the big headaches that can sometimes arise is when maybe we have somebody who, let's say we hire a consultant or a contractor, and this person is working for the company, maybe doing some work temporarily, and then maybe their contract is up in like 3 months or 6 months or a year, whatever. And so what happens is the person gets hired on, we add them to a group, we've given them rights through this group, okay? We've given them maybe role permissions or something, and then 6 months goes by and their contract is up, and now they're no longer work for the company, or maybe they're no longer involved in the project that they were working on, and they're working on a different project now, and unfortunately they still have all the same rights. So, and especially in that kind of scenario where maybe you have somebody that joins the company, they're working on a project for a certain amount of time, and then they get moved over to do something else, and they no longer should have rights to this technology, this resource that we've given them access to. So, Microsoft allows us to do this thing called access reviews. Access reviews will make it where periodically access must be reviewed and determine if somebody should continue to have access to something or be part of a group to continue that permission. So let's take a look at access reviews. Now we're going to start out here. We're on portal.azure.com. We're going to click on the menu button here. We're going to go down to Azure Active Directory. Okay, from there you have a blade called Identity Governance. We're going to go ahead and click on the Identity Governance blade here. And once we get that open, you will see this thing called Access Reviews. So we're going to click on Access Reviews, and at that point, it'll load and it'll tell you if you have any of these, which I don't. So I'm going to click to create a new Access Review. So from there, it's going to ask me, what kind of Access Review are we talking about here? Is this going to involve teams and groups? Is this for a particular application? What is this for? Okay, so we're going to do teams plus groups. All right. So at that point, what are you doing this for? Is this in regards to your Microsoft 365 groups with guests? So maybe this is for, groups involving your guest, or is this specifically for teams involving Microsoft Teams groups? So I'm going to say Microsoft 365 groups with guest users. And at this point, we're going to say guest only scope. All right. So we're going to click new, and we're going to look at this from the standpoint of maybe we're talking about a guest user who has been given rights, been put into a group that's been given rights, and then periodically we need to review that and make sure that they still should be a part of this. So we're going to go right here where it says select reviewers, and you can choose what kind of reviewer you're going to have, whether it be the group owner who's going to make the decision, or a selected users who's going to make this decision. Another interesting thing is you can make it where users have to review themselves and decide if they should be part of that group anymore. So this is kind of based on the honor system, right? And then the user would say, well, no, I'm not even working on that project anymore, so I shouldn't really be part of that group anymore. Or you can do managers of users, which involves whoever the manager is. If you look at a user's attributes, there's an attribute called managers, and whoever the person is that's labeled as the person's manager would make this decision. So I'm going to do a selected user group, and we'll say select the reviewers, and who's going to be the one that's going to handle reviewing this. Maybe we have a person who reviews the groups, and this is going to be maybe this guy Alpha here. So we're going to choose this person, but you could use a group if you wanted to instead of a user to do this reviewing. And then how frequently do you want this review to occur? So you could do weekly, monthly, quarterly, semi-annual, annually. I'm going to do monthly, and then you have the duration of 14 days there. All right. So what will happen is they're going to get this notification to let them know that it's time to get them to review this group and make sure that the people that are in the group, guest or group settings that you're working with here, whoever's in it needs to be reviewed, and whether or not they need to be removed. So you can say never ending, or you can say in on a specific date, or you could have this happen a certain number of times, and then at that point it would stop. So these are pretty self-explanatory. I'm going to click on next, and then at that point, it says upon completion of these settings, do you want to auto apply results to the resource? Go ahead and enable it. If you're still making changes, you can keep it disabled for now. It says if the reviewers don't respond, what do you want it to do? Remove access, approve access, or take recommendations. So I could say remove access. That's going to just remove access to that group for that person. I could say approve access, which means just go ahead and let it go through. And then I could say take recommendations, which take recommendations will be based on Microsoft's recommendations, and that's usually based on the security level that group pretty much has. So I'll just say remove access. Enable reviewer decision helpers. This is going to have little notifications that pop up. So it says no sign in within 30 days. At that point, notice what it says. It says if enabled, system recommendations based on user access information will be shown to reviewers. All right. And then you have some advanced options here, like a justification. So somebody can give a justification, a reason to for approval. You have the email notification. So it's going to send emails to the reviewers as reminders, as well as you have admins. And then general reminders, it tells you this is going to send reminder emails for access reviews in progress to all reviewers at midpoint of the review. So you have the email notifications there to enable email notifications, and you have the reminders at the midpoint. And then you can also add an additional comment or message to the reviewer if you want. At that point, we click Next. And it's going to confirm what we're doing. All Microsoft 365 groups we've selected. We did it for teams and groups, right? We chose the monthly. We chose these settings here. And then, so that just kind of reviews what we did. And at that point, we can click Create. And there you go. You've now created yourself an access review. It does take a few minutes to take effect and come on, but eventually it will come on. And at that point too, we can also view reports on that. You've got additional settings you can look at. I'm not getting into the settings right now, but this is where your access review is going to be configured, and that's how you set it up. Hey, this is John Christopher. I hope you enjoyed getting to experience a little bit of this course, and I hope you'll join me on the full adventure. If you'll check the description of this video, you'll see a link that'll show you how you can get access to the full course. Now, in the full course, you're going to learn how to set up a practice environment where you can practice hands-on, and I'm going to provide you with lots of virtual simulations that you can do 24/7. All you need is a web browser. So I hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll also give me a like and subscribe. I'm trying very, very hard to get this channel to build and grow, and so I hope you'll take the time to do that.